Hey guys, Brian here, and welcome to another coding tutorial. In this series of tutorials, we're going to be using Node and Express to create a backend web application. And this can be an example and a boilerplate of how to create a simple backend for either your web application or a mobile application or any type of client that needs a backend. In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about just the things to install on your system and how to get your project set up. The first thing that you're going to want to install, if you don't already have it, is Node.js. This is the actual JavaScript runtime that we're going to be using that's actually going to power our server. You can go ahead and download the current version and install that one. Now, the next thing we're going to install is actually a Node package called NodeMon. And what NodeMon is able to do is actually monitor your code to see if there's any changes that you've made to it and automatically restart your server if there has been. So this saves a lot of time for you. Instead of having to manually stop and start the server again, NodeMon will do it for you. So this is fairly easy to install. If you come to your command line, and assuming that you've already got Node installed, we're going to use npm. npm is the Node package manager, and it's what you're going to use a whole bunch to manage what packages are used inside of your application. In this case, we're going to go ahead and install -g, which tells Node package manager to install the module as a global module. And what that'll do is allow you to actually issue a command that corresponds to the module. So you can use it in any script or directly from the command line. So in this case, we want to install NodeMon. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, to illustrate what I talked about, you can actually go ahead and then issue the NodeMon command. And it doesn't run because it didn't supply the right arguments, but you can see that because we installed it with the -g flag, it's actually a global command that we can now issue directly from the command line. The next thing that we're going to want to install is MongoDB for our local database. And I prefer to keep everything local instead of using something like a remote database. I just find it easier to manage, and also you learn a little bit more about what's going on and what's happening behind the scenes and how you can set things up from scratch yourself. So you can go ahead and go to the MongoDB homepage and download MongoDB for whatever system you're on. Now, along with MongoDB, what you want to install is something called Robo3T. And this is formerly known as RoboMongo, which is, as you can see, a free lightweight GUI for MongoDB enthusiasts. And what this does is it allows us to have an application to visualize our MongoDB database and perform some actions on it without having to reach to the command line. It just makes things a little bit easier to do. And the last thing that you're going to need, which you probably already have, but if you don't, and I'll show you an example here, is an editor. And what I use is VS Code, and I've bounced back and forth between a lot of different editors, and the one I keep on coming back to is Visual Studio Code for its ease of use, the lightweightness, the extensibility with the extensions, and just the general usability and feel of the program. So this is the one I recommend usually to work with if you don't already have an editor you like. And the nice thing about VS Code is that it's got first-rate support for JavaScript. It's really built with JavaScript and TypeScript in mind. So if you need an editor or you just want to try out VS Code, go ahead and download and install that to your system as well. Okay, now that we've got everything set up and installed on our system for what we need in this tutorial, let's hop back over to the command line. Now, navigate to wherever you want to keep this project. And what we're going to do is actually run a command through the Node package manager called init. Now, what init does is basically just initializes some default variables for your program and keeps them all inside of a package.json file that we'll see in a little bit. For the values that it asks for, it really doesn't matter too much for our project, so you can go ahead and just keep the defaults or enter in whatever you see fit. In this case, I'm just going to go with the defaults. And now, if you look in the directory, we actually have a package.json file. And the package.json file is super important for any Node application. What it does is it pretty much keeps a configuration of your entire application. So it'll have things like all of the packages that your application depends on, any of the scripts that need to be run for your application, and a whole host of other things that if you want to publish your application on NPM, you can actually have your author name and some other information about the package itself. It's really just a centralized configuration file for your application. Now that we've initialized our Node application, we're just going to create some of the basic directories that we're going to be using for the Node application. So you can go ahead and follow along and create these directories. We're going to create the routes directory, the controllers directory, the models directory, the util directory, and the middleware directory. Now, what are these directories going to be holding? Well, the routes directory is going to be holding any of the JavaScript files that are configuring what routes your server should be listening to. So a route is simply what you see at the end of a URL. So when you type in a website, website.com, the slash whatever you have after the .com is the path. So you can set up your server to listen on /API/tools/API/cars, and that'll tell the server that it should be listening for these incoming routes. So again, any of the files that configure what type of routes the server should be listening to, they're going to go in the routes folder. Now, the controllers folder is going to contain all the logic that the files in the routes folder are going to pass it off to. Now, the controllers folder is going to handle all of the logic that is going to be run once any of the routes defined in the routes folder have been hit. So it's going to contain any of the logic that needs to be run for any of the data processing or any of the things that need to happen on the back end once a route is hit on the server. The models folder is going to contain any of the configuration that we need that defines the type of data that we're going to be working with. And so it provides a centralized location to aggregate all of that and be able to keep it in a nice and organized fashion. The util folder is a folder I like to include in applications that basically is going to hold scripts that just have functionality that is kind of miscellaneous, doesn't really fit anywhere else, but it's reused in certain parts of the application. So I like to make a util folder to keep kind of any of that miscellaneous logic in there. Now the middleware folder, and we're going to talk about middleware a little bit more in depth later, but the middleware is going to keep any of the scripts that are related to middleware and Express. And just really quickly, what middleware is and Express is basically functions and logic that run before the actual request is handled. So this is where you can do things like verifying authentication, doing verification of forms, setting up any sort of configuration that needs to happen before the request is actually handled. Those things are just a chain of what we call middleware, where the request gets passed from one to another, to another, to another, to finally your route handler, which will be handling actually all of the logic and the processing that needs to be happening on your server. So we've got our directory structure set up, we installed everything we needed, and we initialized our Node app. In the next tutorial, we're actually going to be looking at writing some code. I'll see you then.